This is your Chargers linebacker, Dan Henley, and you're tuning in with Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. If this is your first time tuning in the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, this is the first podcast that you and I have done since the unfortunate conclusion to the Chargers season after a first-round loss in the wild card round against the Houston Texans. And you and I, much like Chargers fan base, our fellow podcasters, we needed to take a step back, take a deep breath, assess just what the hell happened. But I think enough time has now passed with everybody that whether you accept it or not, we're ready to push forward. We understand. I think we can understand to an extent what the issues were. Let's talk about it. Let's kind of have a state of the franchise conversation. As I was telling Dan before we jumped on the show today, I do not want to go backwards and dissect what happened to the full extent in that Houston game. It just is going to open up a wound that I really don't want to relive, and I'm sure that nobody else does either. So while we still will go ahead and give an overall recap of some of the issues that took place, I want to push the ball forward and take an assessment of obviously what this offseason is going to have entail for it. You heard Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz earlier this week address some of those issues. But Dan, we have combine, free agency, the draft over the next few months. And you know I've just been clamoring to get those chimes into this show any simple way that I can. Even if it comes at the Chargers' first round exit expense, I will get the chimes in this show. I guarantee you that. But Dan, I don't even think that you and I really had a full-on conversation about what took place in that game for a few days.
Nope. It took a while.
We were feeling it.
Yeah. And Chargers fans, I want you to know that you're not alone in the disappointment, in the anger, in the questions. There's a lot of people who have probably more than you or than I or Jake. And that's what it is up to for the front office, for the coaching staff, for these players, as they march forward, to Jake's point, into the 2025 offseason and the draft and all of that jazz. We're not going to go into the minutia of went wrong in that game. We might do some macros. But to Jake's point, I do think it needs to be addressed. We go through the thick and thin together. We go through the ups and the downs, both Jake and I as friends, as well as with all of you listening and watching and tuning in. That sucked. And I think the part that was hard for me was thinking through, I think it was just how much I cared about this team. And not to get all...
I was going to say, cue the flute music behind Dan Wolkenstein if he's about to go off on this tangent.
No, but we've seen, like, in comparison, you look at that Jacksonville loss in the playoffs, and there was so much anger, and there was so much just good old charging, and
rightfully so.
They blew everything, and not that wasn't a likable team, and not that, you know, we weren't behind them, and not that I didn't want to see that team succeed. But we just spent the entire offseason and the 2024 season seeing this team completely change in front of our eyes. They go 6 wins in the plus column better than they did a year ago. Brand new coaching staff, brand new front office, brand new identity. And there's actually identity, some of which is not good, as we saw in that Houston game. But there was so much good change and so many feel-good stories. Not all of them, but there were many feel-good stories. And to see the collective buy-in from players, coaches, fans, media, whatever, just to watch it go by that quick and to watch that much of an egg just splattered all over the television screen for all of us, I think it hurt more in the sense that I was more sad this loss than I was at the 27-0 debacle that turned out to be the 30, whatever it was, 30 to 21, 31-20, whatever, 31-30, excuse me. That was anger more than sadness and like a demand for change. This one just felt more sadness, honestly. And there was definitely anger there too. I'm not going to lie. But this one required a lot more processing. I think the pitchforks were less targeted, if you will. It was more just WTF. After some time, come to terms with it a little bit. Still blows my mind, but we saw a lot of the trends and some of the identities that we were not excited about that we saw throughout the year come to fruition when it mattered most. And that's a tough pill to swallow. But at the same time, if you look back, 11-win season, playoff berth, year one under Harbaugh, Ortiz, given all of the headwinds and constraints that they had, I always said that year one would be a success if they won a playoff game. They won more regular season games than I expected. They didn't win the playoff game. And so I'm still trying to reconcile, after all the brass tacks is done, was it a successful or unsuccessful season? And I don't know if I'm ready to answer that quite yet. So I'll ask you, listeners, fans, tuning in the comments. And then Jake, do you feel that this was a successful season when you put all of the debits and credits stacked up?
I've had to ask myself this question repeatedly throughout this week on how I felt about it. Because to your point, I get your reasons for why you feel the difference between this playoff loss as opposed to the Jacksonville one. And remember, we always had those comments, those stats to back it up. Look what Justin Herbert has when he has a defense that can do this, his record, this, that, and the other. And that Jacksonville loss, while some of it was definitely on the offense just going completely flat, it was also on the defense giving up that amount of points in order for Jacksonville to come back and win that game. Dan, you look at this game against the Houston Texans, and it was almost completely the opposite because the defense did everything they could to keep them in that game for as long as they could, with as much self-inflicted mistakes that the offense was making, the turnovers, the drops, the bad play calling, the offensive line just being terrible for the better part of the entire game.
Inability to run.
And at one point in time, you were winning the turnover battle, but losing in the scoreboard. It was just a weird sequence of events that took place. So I still kind of side with you, but in general, I think where you could find the reasons to say that this season was a success, and it's probably even more so from a lot of the reasons that I was feeling good coming into this playoff game, is because now you know who's running the front office. You know who's running the coaching staff. And when you hear comments like Derwin James saying that he is more confident right now about this team moving forward over the next few years, that tells you something. When you hear Jim Harbaugh at the podium talk about guys returning, says, I would love to have everybody back. Don't know if we will have everybody back, but if there's one player that I could have back, it's Khalil Mack. There is and we have said this on repeat seemingly for the last several months, there has been a shift in culture with this team. that is able to carry to a playoff formula. And we have seen that with other organizations. And this was the one thing that the Chargers seemingly just didn't have since the days of Marty Schottenheimer. Didn't even feel that way against with Norv Turner, even with as far as they went in the playoffs with him. It just didn't feel that way. That was back when the Chargers team was absolutely stacked with talent and they were able to put it together. But it seemingly has felt like forever since you've had a feeling of confidence among your head coach and the players buying into it. And that's the difference. And that is kind of the double-edged sword with this, because those last 3 weeks of the season where the Chargers offense was humming, they were seemingly playing their best football at the right time, putting up 30-plus points per game. You felt confident in that. Justin Herbert was playing some of his best ball of his career those last 3 weeks. And then the things that we had seen just absolutely be the deficiencies of this team throughout the season, the interior of the offensive line, the drop issues, the questionable play calling, and on top of that, Justin Herbert playing one of the worst games of his career. Dan said it. Murphy's Law. Everything that could have happened, happened. But seemingly it was all on the offensive side of the ball until the defense just couldn't hang anymore. They did whatever they could to keep them in that game. And the offense sputtered so poorly, was so bad on third down, could not move the ball, could not run the ball. And when Justin Herbert starts turning the ball over uncharacteristically, I get it. 2 of them were not his fault. 2 of them were. But when you start turning the ball over like that, there's not much you can do about it. There's not much you can do to keep that ship from sinking. And it was an unfortunate turn of events at the worst possible time for this team. So I'm with you, Dan. I can't fully put an answer to that right now, but I will say this. All things being equal, for the same reasons that I was talking about why I felt confident in this team going all the way back to last January to now, is the same reasons why I feel confident with this team moving forward.
I was wondering how long it would take for Darth Dan and Jake Bader to get back. And I don't
Is he
know.
already back?
I don't, like, again, I'm still processing this, but hearing, and I was just listening to some of the words you were using and the reasons that we are optimistic about the future. And what is so puzzling about that game was the things that we were so confident in and the things that have us optimistic about this future and the things that we were banking on as the sky is blue, it didn't show up in the playoffs. Justin Herbert, again, not all his fault. That was one of the worst games I've ever seen. I thought the coaching, especially on offense, Jesse Minter, honestly, he did as best as he could. He did his thing. There were some things I didn't like. Couldn't believe that they let their best offensive player beat them over and over again, and Nico Collins. Most of that, from what I saw, was player execution specific, not coaching specific. But offensively, coaching and execution. Coaching did Justin and company no favors. Pass catchers did Justin Herbert no favors. Pass protection did Justin Herbert no favors. Justin Herbert also did this team no favors at times. There were no adjustments to what was coming, first or second half, by Greg Roman and company. And what I started to realize was how much of this season hinged on players being expected to do more than they were historically doing. And sometimes they would do it. You think of like the Will Dissly season. He had career numbers across the board until it mattered most. Until it mattered most. Quentin Johnston had like a redemption season just off the Vegas game. Until it mattered most. J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Renaissance season for J.K. Dobbins. Again, I'm not blaming J.K., just saying the things that you saw that were Renaissance seasons all turned around. You saw Justin Herbert finally get protected at the end of that season. Until it mattered most. You saw Greg Roman and company finally figure out the passing offense. Until it mattered in the playoffs. And so I put blame on Jim Harbaugh and the coaching staff for going an entire 60 minutes and not one thing changed that actually worked. You didn't see one noticeable coaching difference. That's okay, at least I see him trying. In fact, it got worse on offense. As the game went on, it got worse. Some of that, you give credit to Houston. That defense, D'Amico Ryans, like they had those guys flying. And I will not take away from them. This was not all just the Chargers sucked. Like Houston took it on defense, especially. Sure, lucky bounces at some point. But there was a lot of player execution issues. But the things that you count on most, the sky is blue, the sun is yellow, Justin Herbert plays well, and this coaching staff will be prepared to outcoach the other side. Hell, special teams didn't even show up much in that game. And while I am far more optimistic about the following season this year than I was after that Jacksonville loss, there's still a lot of prove-its. And I think the part that Chargers fans are kind of reconciling with right now is all the bullshit noise that's just going to get louder and louder and louder. You're going to have to just listen, take it on the chin. Can Justin Herbert win a playoff game? I don't know. Hasn't yet. Can the Chargers get over the hump? I don't know. Hasn't yet. Are they going to get weapons to help Justin Herbert? I don't know. Do they have enough weapons? I don't think so. I'm pretty confident of that. I have a lot of questions. Do I believe in this coaching staff? Yes. At the top of it, I believe in Jim Harbaugh at the top. I believe in Jesse Minter, which as of now, it feels like he's good to stay. I think. And I believe in Joe Ortiz to build a roster. We've all said this is the worst roster we will see. And in my opinion, I think that's what you saw in the playoffs. It was a bad roster for the most part that was shored up by a ton of amazing coaching. But then when you bubble it up in the games that matter, especially against a team that has that week to prepare in the playoffs, it's hard to have a weak link on your team in the playoffs because opposing teams will just feast on it. And seemingly it happened throughout the game on both sides of the ball. So I know a little bit of a rant, Jake, and I struggle, I think, because, and I want to get your take on this. You know, I'm not sure if it was a success or not. There were lots of things that were successful about that season and lots of things that changed for the better. What I think is optimistic, in my opinion, is the fact that they were able to improve so much from a micro and macro perspective in one offseason that wasn't even full because of them having to bring in that new staff. Imagine now what this same staff can do, stacking bricks on top of it with an entire offseason, with more comp picks, with actual money to spend, with a blueprint that they can create, not just the itty bitty studs at the foundation, but they can start putting the window dressing on now and with money to do so. So I'm fascinated with how this team moves forward. That, I think, is what gives me optimism and hope. But the reality is there's a lot of question marks that this letdown, I think, only supplanted. And now it feels like, and this is what I was going to ask you, nothing next season matters in the regular season. Nothing. They can go 14-3. The same questions are coming in the playoffs. They can get a first round bye. Same questions are coming in the playoffs. It doesn't matter. So to me, it's like, whatever. Next season, fast forward to week 18, hopefully they're in the playoffs, then the season starts. And I guess that's a good thing. But do you feel that way? Like, it just feels like this just kicks that can to where we can't really be excited about anything else until a playoff win happens.
It's the same type of narrative that follows like Buffalo Bills or the Baltimore Ravens. Like, until you beat the Kansas City Chiefs in the playoffs, really nothing matters. You could beat them in the regular season. Everybody will talk about it that week. But until you do it in the playoffs in order to knock them out, it's not going to matter. So I'm totally with you, Dan, because this game is going to leave a lot of egg on the face that we're going to have to wear and like it until we get to this part of next season. And the fact is that your quarterback played a game like that, that your corresponding weapons players around Justin Herbert played like that. And the unfortunate part about it is that, and I'm not trying to take this away from what the Chargers did with a seemingly, as you said, the worst record that we're going to, or the worst roster that we're going to see Justin Herbert have. But this was an easier schedule. Next year's won't be as easy. The AFC West is only going to get better with the emergence of Bo Nix and the Denver Broncos, and who knows what turnaround is going to happen with the Las Vegas Raiders with their coaching and GM, with their roster building. Who knows?
Mahomes
and you still have to battle and contend with the Kansas City Chiefs, who most likely, spoiler alert, will take the division once again next year and will have to be in this position of going in the wild card round yet again, simply just from the standpoint that Kansas City is a better team. So yeah, we're going to have to wear this egg. The only save face through this, Dan, because as you mentioned, you mentally want to just fast forward to that point of getting there next year. But between now and then, from a roster standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, not necessarily in change, but more schematically,
you hope
there's a lot of questions and improvements that need to be addressed.
I'll ask you it this way, and we could just kind of take a macro question at a time here. From a offense, defense, special teams, if we just kind of snap the line, including the playoffs, which I know that's hard because that was an outlier in almost every respect, for the most part. We talk about culture and identity. So on defense, let's start defense. Let's start in a positive light, in my opinion. What changed in one season? Pretty much everything.
A lot.
Pretty much everything. You saw, which is insane to me, you saw a linebacking core that folks were saying was the weakness of the team turn into a strength. You saw secondary improve across the board with folks who were not on this team last year. You saw edge rushers that were actually healthy come playoff time. You saw all-pro Derwin James again. And you saw a defense that was the best scoring defense in the entire NFL. The entire identity of the Chargers defense changed for the better. Like, on that, zero questions, zero complaints. Sure, there were some middle things that could have happened and some roster changes and injuries kind of plagued some different positions. And we can get into all of that. Got a long offseason. But by and large, defense hit it out of the park. And Jesse Minter, hats off, kudos, golf clap, whatever it is. Give that man a raise. Keep him in LA as long as you can. So tell me what you think of the defense. And then, Jake, I'll let you start with the offense.
Yeah, it's we've talked about how impressive Jesse Minter has been in his first year. So much so to the point where we were saying we're probably only going to have him for one season. Now, unless things change, and based off of Jim Harbaugh's comments, it doesn't sound like anybody's going anywhere, which is great for the Chargers. I think you can definitely build off of what Jesse Minter can bring to this team with some added additions, with a deeper pocket in free agency, with the next complement of draft picks that Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh are going to need to build a winning roster on both sides of the ball. But as you mentioned, Dan, God, especially about that, the secondary unit, you have to once again tip your hat to Steve Klingscale in this conversation as well. Because when you really think about it,
as well,
outside of the safety position, who was playing corner for you last year? Asante Samuels Jr. essentially got 4 games this year before he was lost for the year for his, what we came to find out was a very serious stinger that went all the way back to something that he was born with, if I remember that correctly. So it ended up being a very serious situation that we finally got context on. We were all wondering what the deal was with that. But Dan, Christian Fulton, Cam Hart, Tarheeb Still, that was the makeup of your secondary. Jasir Taylor pretty much got pushed to a reserve role. So you were playing with 3 new corners, both free agency and 2 rookies.
And Elijah Molden, if you want to count him.
And Elijah Molden, if you want to consider him, yes, a corner in that circumstance.
And the other guys from practice squads that were brought in throughout the NFL season.
The fact that you had these guys ready to play on a week-to-week basis when they seemingly just had one offseason to get it right.
Kendall Williamson, Marcus May.
That's impressive. And I don't care who the opponent is. You put that same situation with a different Chargers coaching regime, it fails. I guarantee you it fails. And you do not have the record that you have today under a different regime. Mm-hmm. That's what's impressive. You mentioned the linebacker group. Is there still areas of improvement? Yes, but my goodness, Deion Henley. What you were able to develop under Navarro Bowman as part of this coaching staff.
Hell, Troy Dye looked great.
I'm excited to see what a healthy Junior Colson is going to be. I know he battled injuries throughout this year. I know you and I personally had higher expectations for what he was going to bring. Hopefully we'll get that in year 2. And Dan, the defensive line, again, Tahir Tart, Poona Ford. It's been a long time since we have talked about free agent signings actually contributing on this team.
Or hell, just interior defensive linemen impressing.
Yes. Now, defensive line is going to be interesting as we get to the offseason. Because
changes, for sure.
Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Bud Dupree, there's a chance that all 3 of them could be playing elsewhere.
This feels like a rip the Band-Aid year for Joey Bosa.
It very well
like Keenan Allen last year.
It very well could be. And so that would essentially leave you with Thule. And eventually you're going to have to address this edge position to say, well, what's the future? Who are your future bookends? It's going to be Thule, and essentially right now it's a question mark. Because even if you're able to bring Khalil Mack back, it's only going to be for one more season. You have to address that position at some point. So,
hey, TMB.
Hey, he's one of my favorites. Love the fact that they signed him to a reserve contract.
Yep.
I was really hoping for him to get an opportunity this season. Hopefully he'll be ready for that next year. But that's probably the area that you're going to want to watch for.
Defensive line.
Defensive line. I know I've talked about it in terms of draft needs where you could go in that circumstance. Obviously, the Chargers have deeper pockets for free agency this year. They could address it in one way or another, depending on who's available to them. You know they're going to address corner one way or the other because Joe Ortiz has always said that you can never have enough guys contributing in the secondary. I think if there's one person you absolutely have to bring back, it is Elijah Molden. for as much as he contributed.
I love his play, man.
As much as Jesse Minter lauded his play after he went down with his unfortunate injury, I would think that they're going to make a hard push to bring Elijah Molden back. And then you obviously hear Elijah Molden talking about how much he would like to be back. So I'm not too worried about that. But in general, Dan, you look at this, and outside of roster building, God, coaching, you feel extremely confident in for what that unit was able to build in one off season.
You literally had a dude who had retired, became a scout, turned into one of the biggest keys of your defensive secondary.
A preseason game for the ages. I don't care what you are, where you play, what part of the season it is. That's a hell of a game for Tony Jefferson.
And the dude showed up all season. He showed up in the playoffs too. So Jake, then take the reins for offense. Because after this, I want to get into we'll wrap it up with probably setting the stage for, what's to come, kind of the biggest needs for this team, macro, micro. But 2023 versus 2024 offense. I mean, we could write a novel about this because there are things that changed, but what improvements did we see? And would you say that was a success?
I mean, I think regular season, you could say you can't argue with how efficient Justin Herbert was throughout the regular season. I mean, that was the biggest thing. Scratch that. It was one of the biggest priorities for this coaching staff in terms of protecting the football. Obviously, priority one was protecting Justin Herbert.
I don't think that's honestly, given actions, I don't think that was true. I think priority one was protecting the football.
I think one hand washes the other.
Justin Herbert wrecked this season.
I go back to his regular season. If you're putting that in the case of what took place in the Texans game, I feel you. It's the interior of the offensive line. I'll obviously get into that in a second, but you getting Joe Alt,
huge.
We've talked about how much that was the right move. Retrospect, at the time, whatever it was, that was the right move to do.
And the Joe Alt Lad McConkey duo, like the way that they did that, and if you flip the alternative, if they went wide receiver than tackle, like Correct. There's not a chance in hell.
Justin Herbert, I don't know if he makes it through the entirety of the season if that situation ends up being different. Now, moving forward, now batting back to your original question, 2023 to 2024, where was the improvements? It's an interesting question because it's not a true 1-to-1 ratio, because we're talking about a 2023 offense that had the likes of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and Joshua Palmer.
Sure.
Now, did all three of those players play together that long? No, they did not.
But look at those. If you look at just the receiving core, 23 versus 24,
it's extremely different, because one of the biggest things outside of Lad McConkey that the wide receivers struggled with was getting separation. They just did not do Justin Herbert any favors, which is why I felt like that's how much you needed a good, efficient running game to stay in it, to be able to have that in order to create some play action opportunities for Justin Herbert. And when your offensive line was on, your wide receivers can produce games like Quentin Johnston had with 13 catches and 188 yards. But when they're not, it's completely different. And when you're not...
Let me just remind Chargers fans real quick, because I think this might surprise some folks. Last season, Chargers pass catchers, which is wild just to go back and look at this. So Keenan Allen, dude, had 1,200 plus yards, over 100 receptions, 7 touchdowns. After that, you had Austin Eckler, who had 51 receptions for 400 yards. Gerald Everett, 51 receptions for 400 plus yards. Josh Palmer, 38 catches for 581. Quentin Johnston, Donald Parham, Mike Williams, 3 games. Like, guys weren't doing much. So when we sit here and say, like, oh, that receiving core was way better, like, again, after Keenan, your leading pass catchers was Austin Eckler and Gerald Everett. So then you fast forward, again, just for context, look at this season. We talk about the Keenan Allen insane mode, right? Ladd McConkey, almost 1,200 yards, 1,150, 7 touchdowns. Quentin Johnston up to 711. Will Dissly up to 481. Josh Palmer almost 600 yards. I mean, we want to talk about the names, sure, but if we want to talk about just production, this unit outperformed that. I'm sorry, it did.
Which is wild to say.
Crazy.
Which is wild to say. Now, where do you go from this? Because if you're thinking about where does the most focus need to be put on in terms of roster turnover, things that are going to change, things that Justin Herbert needs, yeah, your focus definitely is going to go on the offensive side of the ball. Just going off the top of my head, Dan, you're probably going to be looking for a new center and guard. In my opinion, that's going to come free agency, because the center class, as much as I was looking into it this year, it's not the center class of net love last year, and it got even weaker with two of the biggest producers actually going back to college. So you're going to have to address that in free agency in some circumstance, because I don't know if you can afford to hitch your wagon to a center that you would draft possibly in the 4th round. I just don't know. Are you going to hit gold like other teams did in this previous draft? It was one of the things that I was very surprised, that as much as Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz were talking about that they see offensive linemen as weapons, that you still have not gotten that long-term option after Corey Linsley. You need to figure that out. Guard, I know everybody has been talking about throw everything that you possibly can. Throw everything that you possibly can at getting a starting guard, because everybody obviously already expects the Chargers not to, or to move on from Trey Pipkins. Maybe you could essentially replace him. Yes. Maybe you just replace him with a different Trey, and that being Trey Smith, because that's basically everybody's favorite guard target for everybody to go after. But you're going to find some competition for Trey Smith, and for good reason, because he is that good. So you need to shore up the offensive line. On top of that, Dan.
Well, but we'll get into like the needs, like that part. I think there's a whole basket of conversation in just that. But if we're just focusing on like offense, is this better than last year, or what was better than last year? Like, I think receiving core, I think you could argue production wise was better this year, which is insane. I know that sounds crazy, but just go look at the numbers. Rushing game, as much as we saw it fizzle at times this year, I mean, we forget how bad the running game was in 2023. I mean, it was awful. Austin Eckler had a 3.5 yards per attempt, and honestly, that was because he has a couple broken rushes. Otherwise, like, it was way low. I mean, J.K. Dobbins is 4.6 yards per carry this year. He had 900 yards rushing, and he was out on IR. So say what you will. The rushing, I mean, that is something that identity-wise, I think is clearly changed. Now, do they have the pieces that they would like to have to implement a successful running game?
Not yet.
Some.
Not yet.
But clearly not enough. But I would say that improved. As much as we want to poo-poo on the pass protection, like, I think it's clear their left tackle, right tackle combo, I don't think you can get much better than that, like, honestly. So, like, that part's on lock year one. The interior is a lot of work. I think their running back stable needs a lot of work. Tight end room needs a lot of work. But like, think about how much money they have. Running back, tight end, interior offensive line. For the most part, those are 3 relatively inexpensive fixes. Relatively. Now, they can go out and spend for a top tier running back, sure. Go get Najee Harris. I don't know, whatever you want. You can go get a top tier interior offensive line. You can use your capital in the draft. So, in your opinion, looking at some of the frustrations that we saw this year, Justin had to deal with the high ankle sprain. He had all kinds of issues early in the season. The Quentin from last year versus this year. The play calling, the types of situations that they put themselves in. Would you say the offense this year compared to last year was an improvement?
Believe it or not, yeah,
I agree. As weird as that sounds,
it's crazy to say. And again, I go back to the moments that Greg Roman made a change, figured it out, which is more than I could say under a previous regime in terms of actually making improvements.
Yeah, something happened eventually.
Something actually happened. You go back to Game 5 against Denver. I felt that was the beginning of Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh shifting things for how they played those first 4 weeks of the season. Then you go a little bit further, especially those last 3 weeks of the season. They turned it on. They figured out something. Their offensive line at that point in time was playing their best collective football of the season. And you saw what happens when you give Justin Herbert time. All these problems that we were talking about in terms of wide receiver separation and man coverage, you give Justin Herbert time, he's going to find the open guy. And somebody's eventually going to get separation. But when you don't, and it's the standard time for any quarterback to get rid of the football, outside of Ladd McConkey, you didn't have an option. You did not have an option.
But the fact that you were, again, I said this from the very beginning, the fact that you were relying on Will Dissly to be your Travis Kelce, like, that's
at times it was impressive. And I loved the fact that we could talk about Will Dissly during the regular season becoming that guy. I loved the fact that at certain points of the year that Quentin Johnston would take a step up. Totally. He had that rough game of the Ravens that brought back everybody's feels of the Packers a year before. And I felt like over those next several weeks, he responded. And then, hey, crescendo against the Raiders to have that type of gameplay from him. As you mentioned, though, disappeared when they needed him most.
5 targets, no receptions in the playoffs.
But guys like Simi Fehoko that contributed at certain points. Other wide receivers that, again, it was kind of just like a ragtag bunch this year at wide receiver. And for Justin Herbert to have the stats that he did in the regular season and for this team to win 11 games with a wide receiver group that was in publication written as arguably the worst collective group in the league, that's impressive.
And again, like, you think of why the offense was as good as it was, right? So I think this is the part that gets lost on some people. Like, who was counted on? You had a rookie receiver who went off, a rookie right tackle who went off. You had your quarterback who did everything that was asked of him during the regular season. You had a guy who was crippled with injuries over the past several seasons in J.K. Dobbins, who had a resurgent year for the most part, other than the quick IR stint, but still had over 900 yards. As a Chargers running back, that's pretty good. You had a tight end who is not a pass catcher in Will Dissly, who all of a sudden like breaks career marks by a landslide. Like, those are the guys that you relied on to outkick their coverage, to outperform. Justin Herbert was efficient. He didn't throw picks. He was safe with the football. But look at who you had to rely on to get to 11 wins in a playoff berth. Like, you had to have Will Dissly go off and not be Will Dissly you've seen in the past. Hayden Hurst didn't even show up, really, because of some of the issues that he had to go through this season. So they didn't really have the pass catcher. You know, you're relying on Tucker Fisk at times.
We made a great catch, by the way, in that opening drive.
Yes. You saw Darius Davis get utilized a little bit more in the secondary. Simi Fehoko looked great in the preseason. He was injured for much of it. Didn't see any Brendan Rice. Like, again, and maybe this is starting to flip my perspective a bit towards it being a successful season, all things considered. Like success wise, was it a success? No, but given what they had, it's hard to say that they could have gotten more out of this group. And so offensively, yeah, like it was frustrating at times. But if I just kind of take a step back, like the things that can be resolved or that were not good, like you can't fix Rome in a day, or you can't build Rome in a day. And they can do everything in one offseason. But man, like the things that we're all clamoring for right now, like it's in front of them. They can get interior offensive line help in a hurry. This tight end class looks pretty good. This running back class looks insane, apparently.
Oh, it's a great class. It's a great class. Dan, everybody's clamoring for a certain guy over there in Cincinnati. I'd be shocked if the Chargers do not make a big splash in free agency, specifically at the wide receiver position. And a couple of the things
it makes sense,
lead
man.
you to believe it outside of what you have. Joshua Palmer's a pending free agent.
And
you know you need
where was he this season? Like, there are so many just weird things that you thought you were going to count on and you couldn't. But like, I think to your point, as much as there are reasons why you would say it wouldn't make sense for a Jim Harbaugh-led team to go out and spend big money on a wide receiver, it also would kind of make sense why that Jim Harbaugh-led team with Greg Roman would be like, absolutely, let's just go get the known dude.
Let's not forget the fact that this team tried to acquire Deontay Johnson twice. Once at the trade deadline, and once when he went back on waivers. Deontay Johnson, hey, maybe it was a good thing in disguise because Deontay Johnson was seemingly passed around like gravy at Thanksgiving for as many teams as he was on this season. But it shows you what the Chargers were trying to do. They were trying to get another wide receiver at the trade deadline. They were trying to get him again when he became available on waivers the first time around from the Baltimore Ravens. And unfortunately, they weren't successful in doing it. Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh are going to take a deep, deep look at this.
Well, you heard them talk about at that press conference post-season. They did Justin Herbert a disservice.
Yes.
And they did not put him in situations where
remember those words.
Yeah.
And I think outside of receiver, offensive lineman is included in that conversation. Mm-hmm. Other skill positions are included in that conversation.
Totally.
So I don't think there's any way that you get out of free agency without
at least.
And we'll obviously see the names that become available come March, but I don't think that there's any way that they get out of free agency without making a big splash for a skill position player on offense.
So I think to wrap up the offensive side, like generally speaking, with the asterisk of given what they had, I would say they outperformed.
Yeah, again, it's while you could say that they outperformed, I still think that there's plenty of room for improvement for 100%. Greg Roman in year two. I think that the fact that you're going to have consistency for Justin Herbert with an offensive coordinator for seemingly the first time in 3 years,
much to some people's frustration.
Look, I
get it.
I could totally understand why, based off of certain things that we saw throughout this season. But you can't just keep doing this.
Yeah,
it's between Joe Lombardi, Kellen Moore, and now Greg Roman. You can't keep doing this to your quarterback and the rest of the offense for them to come in and have to learn a new scheme. I get the reasons why people are frustrated about it. But I think that Greg Roman, based off of what he was able to do with the limited amount of weapons available to him, a spotty offensive line, and to still get 11 wins out of it.
And you could say that was in spite of the offense. Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, in spite of the offense collapsing on itself.
But
in spite of the
wins,
defense keeping that team in games.
But as a head coach and as a GM, if that gets you to 11 wins, and if you have to rely on your defense for a year, like, I think you would do it.
Sure.
Like, imagine Kansas City and Chargers switching into your offensive lines.
Oh.
Justin Herbert's back there having a picnic.
File his tax returns.
By himself, using TurboTax on dial-up with how much time he have. In this running game, Justin Herbert, would you have to throw it? He could just, like, sit back on a couch, put his feet up, hand it off to JK or whoever, Genty, I don't care, doesn't matter. Go crazy. So given what they had, I think the offense was improved. Now, again, to your point, there's a lot of shit that went bad. But how much of that was because of the coaching and how much of that was because they just didn't have the horses or the resources, i.e. money?
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of both. It's
more, in my opinion, the latter, if I had to be honest. Like, do we think Zion Johnson is the future at guard? Jamari Sawyer at guard? Bozeman at guard? I don't know. Questionable at best. At best. So we'll get into that later. I guess we have to touch on special teams for a second. There were many things about the special teams, or about this team in 2023 that was awful. But one of the shining stars was that of special teams. And if we had to compare the high bar from 2023 to 2024, but I would say it maybe went down a tick. But again, in context, right? Like, there were important key pieces who were injured or not on this team anymore that contributed on special teams. So I kind of want to say it's a wash. I mean, Cameron Dicker was outstanding again. I think the punting situation had peaks and valleys.
Yep.
Coverage, peaks and valleys. Darius Davis had struggles at times. So I would say it's a wash. Maybe went down a little bit year over year. But I believe in Ryan Ficken to fix that.
I do too. I don't think that you could look at this season and consider it a huge step back or a failure in any stretch of the word for Ryan Ficken. I love the fact that you brought out that there were certain guys because, again, some of them unsung heroes that we really don't talk about that much. But Simi Fehoko, the reason that he won the battle essentially over Brendan Rice was because of his special teams play, because of his ability to block. And unfortunately, he was down for a majority of the year. Nick Neiman, who's a stout special teams contributor, was down for a period of the year. And you had some of these, and you had some of these interchangeable pieces that you had to move around and create your new unit with. And for the most part, they did a good job once again. To your point, I don't feel that they were as strong as they were a year ago, but a year ago, the special teams unit was the best unit that was on the Chargers. And that's saying something considering the fact that you had Justin Herbert as your quarterback. But unfortunately, it was of your coaching staff and your free agent contributions that never ended up returning an investment. And so when we had the conversation last year about the special teams unit being the best of the three last year, I'd say the other two units caught up to special teams in dramatic fashion 1 year later.
So I think what I'm starting to kind of come around to is we've talked about this in years that were terrible and in years where were successful in terms of playoff berths and wins. I think this coaching staff made this roster better.
100%.
Not everybody, but by and large, given who was on the roster and how much these cap hits were and the names that were and were not on this team, seeing folks ball out the way they did and have resurgent seasons or rookie seasons or renaissance seasons, looking at you, Tony Jefferson, Marcus Mays of the world. Like, you have to be optimistic about what this coaching staff can do with talent and or lack thereof. And so give this coaching staff and front office another season with resources to build the roster. You have to have optimism about what they can do with it. You just got 11 wins with that roster. We all want to poo-poo these guys that this Chargers team has, but yet not give credit to the fact that they're still winning. Like, that's huge, dude. So it's a frustrating time these past whatever week, I think. But as you kind of zoom out and just look at what this team had to work with, look who they were relying on. I mean, you had Denzel Perryman out there, and you notice when he wasn't there, the difference. You mentioned the secondary, like what they had to rely on in order for that to even look like a secondary. Defensive line was a strength. Now, we didn't see as much of pressure as we thought we would, but we saw them be able to be healthy when it mattered most in the playoffs. Now, they stepped up in the playoffs too, but the interior offensive line was a struggle. It was brutal. And look at the resources that are there right now. And how many of them were from this coaching staff? One. And Bradley Bozeman, would you say he worked out? I don't know. We'll get into that later. It's hard not to be optimistic about the team's future because of who they have at the helm making decisions. That doesn't mean, though, that there's a lot of questions that are going to have to be answered. And rightfully so. You know, like, do I have faith in Justin Herbert can win a playoff game? Absolutely. Do I understand the questions of if he can? Yes. Of course. Do I think Quentin Johnson can improve another year? Yes. Do I understand the questions of why people might question that? Yeah. I get it. Like, there's a lot of things that have to change, but they're in the right direction. And given how much they were able to change in one offseason that wasn't even full, I understand why there's so much optimism in that locker room, in that building. Because to hear so many guys that bought in and putting their name on wanting to return, like, that's not normal for a Chargers team. When you have that many folks that outwardly going to battle and going to war on behalf of their coach and vice versa. So moving forward, and you're allowed to change your perspective as this offseason continues, but in no particular order, let's go like top 5. And it could be macro or micro. But the things but tactically, we have to be able to do something to do it. What do you think are in no particular order, 5 biggest areas that need to be improved this offseason? And again, that can be, I don't want this to be, they need to be more physical. No shit. Okay. But like, what can they do tactically? I mean, I won't get into it, but tactically, what do you see as a priority? Top 5 right now. Chargers fans, I'm asking you the same question. Put in the chat if you agree.
Look, you have to improve that offensive line again, not just for Justin Herbert's benefit, but I think for the benefit of making Greg Roman's offense 2.0 work properly. And that's
like tactically guard center. Are you saying to get
guard center? You have to fix that interior of that offensive line. Which
so 2 starting center, so 2 or 3 new.
You have to prioritize that.
Okay.
Whether or not you're going to bring Zion Johnson back, time will tell. But I think Bradley Bozeman and Trey Pipkins, I think their time has come. How is that going to help Justin Herbert? Well, it's going to help Justin Herbert in a multitude of different ways. I think it's also going to affect the run game dramatically because I would like to see a positive gain from a running back on this roster, not have to rely to running to Rashawn Slater's side every single time. I would like to see positive runs running behind somebody else for a change. I think that's going to add a lot of overall balance. And in general, I think that's what Greg Roman really needs out of his offense. So you improve the interior of this offensive line as a whole, That's what it's going to provide tactically.
So
for this
interior
offense.
offensive line is one.
Yes, 100%. Two, it's kind of obvious that you have to get some skilled players for Justin Herbert, given what the roster is, given what the current pending free agents are at certain situations. And this is lumping in wide receiver, tight end, running back, all inclusive.
Not to me. I think there's running back and then there's tight end / receiver. But still. I'm
simply looking at it from ascertaining roster pending free agents. Like, are you going to be spending first round picks on all these positions? No. But I think, are you going to figure out a way to address all three of these positions through free agency in the draft? 100%. So I definitely think that is going to be something that this front office is going to do, whether it's free agency in March, draft in April, doesn't matter. Now, flip it over to the other side of the ball.
Well, so are you saying 2, 3, 4? So priority 1 is offensive line, priority 2, 3, and 4 are tight end, running back, wide receiver?
No. You said no particular order.
No, I'm not saying in order. I'm saying of the 5. Are those all 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yes.
Okay.
No. Sorry. Lump the skill position players as one priority.
Okay.
Now let's flip it over to the defensive side of the ball, because this is where you're going to have questions. As I mentioned earlier, Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Bud Dupree arguably could all be playing elsewhere, retired, who knows, next season. How are you going to
added Tyler Tart and Poona Ford?
Yes, I didn't even talk about them, Morgan Fox included. Where are you going to get your pass rush from? Who's going to be returning? That is a huge question mark. So who knows how you address that, but you got to figure that one out, because Jesse Minter needs guys to get after the quarterback in order to make his defense work.
I think in that lens, I think one of those priorities is to spend your money on your own talent wisely.
Mm-hmm.
And so as much as we want to talk about like focusing on, going out and getting tight ends and receivers and running backs and all of that, like I think there's a serious question of how much you would spend to keep JK and how much of a priority that is. I think there's a serious question with how much you would spend to keep the likes of Khalil Mack, of Poona Ford, of Tyler Tart, of Elijah Molden. Like, these are serious questions.
Well, the good thing is, as opposed to a year ago, when you could go down the list and say, pending free agents, which ones are you going to bring back? Because most of the ones that Tom Telesco signed to big-time contracts did not end up returning the investment for you. This time it's a little different, because this time you got more of a group of one-year rentals that ended up really contributing for you.
Yeah.
And so the decisions are a little bit tougher. Not in terms of to say, hey, would you love to have him back? Absolutely. But it's, can you make the money work? And how many can you bring back? That's going to be a big challenge for Joe Ortiz and the front office this season. I mentioned the edge players in general. Corner. Is Christian Fulton going to be returning? I don't know about Asante Samuel Jr. But you need to reinforce that secondary. Like I mentioned, Elijah Molden, in terms of the secondary players that for sure you would love to have back, he would be at the top of the list. But that Joe Ortiz is going to reinforce that secondary once again, whether it's through free agency or the draft. He's going to do that. You have to have those playmakers back there in order to allow Derwin James to play in the fashion that he was this year. This was Derwin James' resurgence year. This was his circa 2018. But the reason that you were able to do that is because certain guys in the secondary with him allowed him to play closer to the line and got him back to that form that we were used to him seeing. How are you going to address that?
It's interesting you mentioned secondary, because I think a sneaky position that I don't think people are putting enough stock into, this team putting a high draft capital in, is corner. Because you just look at that wild card game. Imagine if the Chargers had a bona fide CB1 that stopped Nico Collins. Just that one change alone, what that would do. And giving this team a bona fide CB1. And look, you give credit. Like Cam Hart balled out for lots of the season. Tari still looked great as a rookie. Christian Fulton at times looked good. At times struggled. Sure. Dean Leonard stepped up in the playoffs. Like there's a bunch of corner. Eli Apple. Like you can go down the list of these names, but like, are these CB1s? Honestly, are any of them CB1s? Christian Fulton may be the closest thing to a CB1 on paper that this team has. So I could absolutely see them giving Jesse Minter a CB1 and let him cook. You saw what he could do with CB3s and 2s and 4s and 5s and 6s and 7s.
I remember what he could do with a Will Johnson in his secondary as well.
Dude. You hear one thing that I thought was interesting, and I know we're going long here, but it's been a while. This you heard a lot from Brandon Staley, the previous regime, about like I forget all the buzzwords that they were using, but building a bully, and you hear so many of those isms. And I truly believe that that was the goal of that staff, to do that. But it just wasn't their roster, and it wasn't who they were. Like they just
it's fun.
It sounded nice.
It's fun to pretend.
It sounded nice, yes. But like you can tell that this front office and this coaching staff was like, damn it. Like I know y'all want to be fancy, but like we're doing this rugged stuff. And there's only so much you can do given who you have. And so I am fascinated to see like another Ben Herbert offseason, another like strength and conditioning, another what archetype that they go after in free agency in the draft, because everything they went after last year was like team oriented, bring your lunch pail, football playing Jesse's through and through. Every single one of them was like that. There were some outliers, but for the most part, that's who it was. I'm curious, like what alpha players are brought in at what positions? Because
that's the question.
Right now, they don't have an alpha receiver. Like Ladd McConkey's a dude, and you can say he's a wide receiver, sure. But I'm talking alpha personality. Like you need something outside, 3rd and 10, 1-on-1, with safety at the top. Who's going to go win?
You need an alpha in the interior.
They don't have either of those.
You got one at left tackle. You've got a perennial one at right tackle.
Yep. You don't have any in tight end room. None.
But God, you see the drop off from Corey Linsley. It is
healthy Corey Linsley.
You need an alpha in the interior.
Yeah. So tight end, no alpha. Receiver, no alpha. Running back right now, technically, no alpha. You have Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal. Those are the only ones who are on contract right now.
Keep in mind, you don't have first round picks to find all these alphas. And as we have found out every single year, you're not going to be able to fill every need every single season either. Mm-hmm. But this is now the first time under the Joe Ortiz, Jim Harbaugh regime that not only do you have a full complement of draft picks, but you also have deep pockets to spend. How are you going to do that? And what are you going to prioritize?
They have the alpha at safety in Derwin, obviously. I think if they keep Khalil and Thule, I think your alphas are set there. They got the alpha in Deion Henley, in my opinion. So for me, it's those gaping holes, like how much incremental lift they can get from them. To me, it's interior offensive line. If they got a stud tight end, i.e. like a Travis Kelce type, like you can make your offense hum in many different ways, right? But something that can give you like multiple dividends in multiple different scenarios.
Dan is speaking the language of many people's offseason acquisitions seemingly in the NFL draft.
Shout out to Penn State and Michigan.
Yep. Mm-hmm. You can add Bowling Green in there as well.
I think whether it's JK and / or just to insert a baller at running back.
It'll be a running back by committee. That's what it'll continue to be under Gus Edwards, or excuse me, under I don't know why I said Gus Edwards.
Well, I mean, including Gus Edwards, if I'm assuming they keep him. But yes, under
Greg Roman is what I meant to say.
But there are so many ways that they can go. But I think for me, it's like, which positions were they affected most by lacking that alpha? And to me this year, it was like tight end for damn sure. More as a pass catching tight end, but more just like an alpha playmaker on the outside specifically. They were missing that bona fide CB1 at the most crucial times for the most part. And their interior just got absolutely smoked. And so, like, for me, if you can fix those, bring in the guys who were helping to solve a lot of those things, like, yeah, like, Will Disley's not going anywhere. He's staying. That's a good thing. I think Elijah Molden's huge, to your point. I agree. Other than that, like, there was a bunch of one-year dudes like Puna Ford, Tyre Tart. They were awesome. And I think you could probably bring them back. But other than that, like, it's a pretty clear canvas for this GM and front office to work with. And so that'll make it fun. That'll make us have so many storylines that we can talk about and make this next season exciting. Again, it will only matter when it comes to the playoffs. But how this team rises to the challenge, I believe that they can because of who's running it. And that's a change. Like, that's an exciting difference of this team. Is you have belief at the top down. What they do with it, I don't know. I know we went long, Jake, and there's a lot of like feelings in this and processing and perspective. Was there anything else that we wanted to get through on this episode that you wanted to get off of your chest this episode?
No, this was our therapy. Honestly,
Yeah,
it was turning the page on 2024 season.
Not gonna lie, Jake, you and I talked about this. There were so many voicemails after that game, and I think collectively,
first of all, appreciate everybody that called in.
Yes.
I told Dan before we got on the show that while I wanted to address it, because we haven't had a podcast yet since that game, I just didn't want to dwell on it. I didn't want to go backwards in talking about it. We can make our assessments. That's fine. I get it. Still, people are pissed off about it, and I fully understand why. But to Dan's point, this is now an off season of questions that is going to linger with a certain player wearing number 10 until we get to this point next year. And honestly, it's something that we're all gonna have to live with and listen to. Just expect all that. Don't take it as disrespect.
Yep.
Understand why the questions are there. Some people can be brazen. They could take it a little bit too far. Hey, you're gonna have those people because that's how some of them like to have clickbait, or some of them like to stay on the island of relevancy, whatever. But you have to understand that this is going to be the egg that's going to be worn on Justin Herbert until next year. And he knows it. He knows it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't want to spend the better part of an hour dwelling over what went wrong.
And much like Jake and I didn't come on here with a lot of the, maybe one could think of it as like toxic thoughts or feelings and emotions and things right after the loss, because boy, did we have them. And yes, you did too, Chargers fans. Much like we are not going over those personally, I think we've collectively decided to just kind of flush that as a show. And that's no disrespect to all the people that called. And honestly, like, there's a lot of thought into what we're going to do with this. To Jake's point, I think therapeutically,
I think we all needed to take a step back, understand what happened, and let's move forward. I'm excited as hell now to have our next live show because Dan and I have kind of gotten an opportunity to talk about this. I know everybody else has so many questions about what the next few months are going to have in store because there's a lot of things to be excited about. If you're a draft nerd like me, you don't give a damn about the underwear Olympics. You're going to watch it. You're going to watch the NFL Combine. Hell yes. You're going to be focused in on what the Chargers are going to do for the NFL draft. Absolutely. And you're going to be watching on April 24th when the NFL draft goes down. And if you are anything like me, you're going to chain your ass to the couch and enjoy 3 days of the NFL draft. That's how we get through this bullshit.
Fact, not opinion.
Yes.
We made it through, Jake. You know, I feel like I owe some type of billing to you for that therapy session. Thank you. I feel better now. I do feel better, actually. I wasn't expecting to feel better after this, but I do. Anything else, Jake? Before we get out of here for the weekend. I'm not going to be watching it. I'm not watching football this weekend. Anything else you want to do?
Time to turn the page.
Like Belichick said, we're on to, what was it? We're on to Cincinnati. We're on to 2025.
Well, we're on to the offseason.
Cool. We're on to the offseason with Cancun and pina coladas, and then we get to go to work. Happy 2025 to you and yours. Jake, this will be fun. Another season in the books. Another season in store. Excited to once again do this with you and the entire LAFB crew. For Jake, you can find him at Jake T. Hefner, myself at Dan W Sports. This has been Chargers Unleashed, and we'll talk to you next time.